Welcome, and thank you for joining us today in the beautiful Aga Khan Garden, located within the landscape of the University of Alberta Botanic Gardens. The Reflections at the Aga Khan Garden will be a series of conversations with thought leaders aimed to promote global citizenship and engage in dialogue on the most relevant issues of our time.
Together, the three of us serve as the co-chairs of the Joint Liaison Committee, a partnership established between the University of Alberta and the Ismaili Council for Edmonton in 2010.
In 2018, the Aga Khan Garden at the University of Alberta Botanic Garden was officially inaugurated, celebrating over 40 years of partnership between the University of Alberta in Canada and the Aga Khan Development Network.
The Aga Khan Development Network is a group of private, international, non-denominational agencies working to improve living conditions and opportunities in countries. Each agency works within individual but complementary mandates covering education, healthcare, and the environment, agriculture, and architecture, to name a few.
The University of Alberta, located in Edmonton, Canada, on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland, is a top 5 Canadian university and one of the top 130 in the world, with over 38,000 students across 18 faculties at 5 campus locations.
On behalf of the University of Alberta, the Aga Khan Development Network, and the Ismaili Council for Edmonton, we welcome you to today's event. Although it is a virtual event, we look forward to welcoming visitors from around the world to see the garden in person when it is safe to do so. We encourage all visitors to enjoy the contemplative context of the garden and to consider our respective roles in supporting more inclusive, supportive, and respectful society for all.
Hello everyone, my name is Aliya Jasmine Sovani. I'm an environmental journalist from Canada, now based in California. Welcome to this new event series, Reflections at the Aga Khan Garden. The goal of this series is to create a global platform for international dialogue. Now, the 4.8 hectare Aga Khan Garden was a gift from His Highness the Aga Khan to symbolize the continued intellectual, educational, and cultural collaboration between the University of Alberta and the Aga Khan Development Network. The Aga Khan Garden's mandate is to bring to life the principles of pluralism and environmental stewardship while contributing to Canada's rich architectural and cultural landscape. The Aga Khan Garden is a place, quote, to learn, for sharing, for romance, for diplomacy, and for reflection on the destiny of the human race, end quote. In the next 25 minutes, we will explore the impact of climate change on agriculture, on food security, and on habitat. And our speakers that will be joining us today are Dr. Stanford Blade, the Dean of Agriculture and Life Sciences at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, as well as Mr. Onno Ruhl, the General Manager of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, and he is based in Geneva, Switzerland. Let's start this conversation. So this event is hosted virtually at and by the Aga Khan Garden at the University of Alberta. Now, the garden's designer, landscape architect Thomas Waltz, actually described this garden as being a traditional Islamic garden that was actually functioning. His Highness the Aga Khan said that it was intentionally designed to contribute to local agriculture. So Dean Blade, I asked the first question to you. Can you explain how the Aga Khan Garden contributes to local agriculture in Alberta, and also why this is noteworthy?
Well, thank you for the question, Aliya Jasmine. His Highness is correct. The garden really is a microcosm of agriculture in this region. I think about the Bustan with its fruit trees, and really it links to the kinds of things that we do within our faculty. Our faculty connects agriculture to food, to nutrition, to human health. And really, the garden mirrors that with the diversity of plant material. And when we have the thousands of people that come to visit the garden, they start to understand the rhythm of growth, the cycles of production. So the garden is really just a great microcosm of the type of agriculture that happens in our region.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Because the Aga Khan Garden itself contributes to wetland restoration in Alberta, right? And many of us know that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 6 is clean water and sanitation. And just this week, Nature United in Canada, which I sit on the board of directors for, released their Natural Climate Solutions report, which says that using nature is actually the most effective way to combat the climate crisis, and it's also the most cost effective. So while all of these, nature-based solutions sound very exciting in theory, Onno Ruhl, I ask you, can you speak to this issue of water security and, green infrastructure, and how the work of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat actually relates to this in a practical way?
Thanks so much, Aliya Jasmine. That's a great question, and it's really important, first of all, to understand the basic logic that when we talk about the climate crisis, many of us talk about the fact that we need to save the planet, when in fact what we need to do is save human existence on the planet. The planet will be just fine without people. And so it's about us, not the planet. And the way to think about it is that we need to restore the equilibrium between humans and nature on the planet so that both can survive. And it's really important to understand that without that equilibrium, it won't work. So that's the logic behind how we work at the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. We work significantly in the high mountain areas in South and Central Asia, very important areas, as we know, traditionally for the AKDN. And in those areas, you got glacier melt, you got rising temperatures 3 times faster than in the rest of the world. And you also so you're on the front lines of climate change, just like the North Pole or the South Pole. It's just that in the Himalayas, there's actually people living on that front line. So what we do, we could deepen that a lot more, is to work with the people who live them to make them resilient to the threats of climate change, because it basically means that everything water related becomes more dangerous, because in the short term there's more water, there's more melt, there's more avalanches, more floods, more mud flows, and we need to find a way to help people be resilient to that and adapt to that reality and be ready for 30 years later, when the glaciers unfortunately will have significantly melted, and be ready for a period where there'll be less water. So we take a very long-term approach. But in the short term, we try to help people adapt rather than move away, because we don't believe giving up that habitat is a good strategy for humanity on the planet.
Oh, that's really interesting, the idea to help people adapt and stay rather than move away. And that kind of brings me to another question, which is that about climate change as a whole. As we see the climate crisis becoming more and more of a pressing issue, how is it affecting both of your pantheons? How is, the climate crisis affecting climate refugees? And for you, Onno Ruhl, and for you, Dean Blade, how is the climate crisis and the intensity that we're seeing with climate change impacting food security and agriculture?
Well, thanks very much, Aliya Jasmine. Yes, we see that climate issues, of course, face the agriculture and food sector. I do quite a bit of work in sub-Saharan Africa, and when we see the volatility of weather events, the issues around droughts in some cases, or extreme flooding in others, this has a tremendous impact on local communities. And of course, where we are here in Western Canada, those same weather events can also be significant issues. Of course, here there are also safety nets and supports for farmers that certainly there will be no access for subsistence farmers in other parts of the developing world. So, agriculture has adapted over 10,000 years. I'm trained as a plant breeder. People have been selecting new types of crops over that period of time as climates have changed, as the weather has modified. But it's those really volatile events and those types of weather and climate change issues where farmers can't have the time to adapt. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking into on a research and innovation side to be able to find those solutions that farmers across the world will be looking for.
So let me ask you a quick follow-up to that. When you are talking about climate change affecting crops, are you talking about like wildfires, floods? These are the kind of things that are impacting crops for farmers?
Across the entire spectrum, certainly we see when there are droughts, the wildfires in South Australia, the significant drought in Southern Africa in the past 2 or 3 years. These are all those issues that become, of course, the guiding issue for people that are trying to maintain food security for their families, for their communities, and these are the issues that we need to deal with.
Wow, that's so interesting. And Onno Ruhl, I'll ask you the same question. We keep hearing so much about this climate crisis and climate refugees. So can you explain to me how the intensity of the climate crisis is impacting climate refugees? And perhaps for those of us who don't know, what exactly is a climate refugee? What does that mean?
Thank you. That's a really important point, and it's actually key to the work that we do at ACA, as we call the Agency for Habitat. The logic is simple. There are people who live in areas that are currently already under active threat because of climate change that has already happened. Many of us think climate change is about, buying a Tesla so that we'll be okay in the future. But in fact, there's 500 million people in the world whose current habitat is already actively under threat because of what has already happened. Many people know about coastal communities, islands, the Maldives, places like that. Many people also know about the North and the South Pole and the ice melt, but there's less attention to people who live in mountainous areas. Mountainous areas are the front line of climate change. Well, at the AKDN, we work primarily in mountainous areas and in coastal areas. And therefore, most of our beneficiaries are, in fact, potential climate refugees. Because one of the things you can do is say, well, it's getting dangerous, I'm just going to live somewhere else. Now, think about that for a moment. 500 million people already under threat. So let's move somewhere else. The question is, what does that mean if 500 million people started to move in the world to try and live in a safe place? Would all the mountain people go to the cities? Well, actually, in South Asia, the cities, think of Karachi and Bombay, they're at the coast. So that also doesn't work. There's no place to go. If that number of people, or even 100 million people, or frankly, even 20 million people started moving, you'd have wars all over. The refugee crisis in Europe in 2015 was about 3, 4, 5 million people moving, not even that. And it almost brought the European Union down. So the logic is that rather than say, let's just give up on the habitat people move, we work on improving the habitat. And this is where His Highness the Aga Khan really had a fantastic vision when he created the agency that I have the honor to lead. When he said, well, actually, we've been mapping risks of natural disaster for a long time. The risks are getting worse, but guess what? It's not enough to work with these people so that they can survive. You actually have to work so that they can thrive, do well. Because people will move if they don't do well where they are. And everybody has access to information and knows that there's something better somewhere else. So we try to work with people who live on the front line of climate change, use the data that we generate about risks and the resilience that we built with them to make sure that the kids can do well. Of course, also the older people, but the kids and particularly the girls are so important because they're the ones who can lift families out of poverty. And we try to not just keep them alive where they live, but actually plan for a better future despite the threat of climate change. It's a very ambitious goal, but I find a very inspiring one, and we love working on it, and the work is really interesting.
Yeah, Mr. Ruhl, you brought up something really interesting when you mentioned the Tesla. Indeed, when we talk about fighting the climate crisis, we think of solutions like, buying a Tesla or going vegan. And indeed, these are things that I think perhaps some of us take for granted in the Western world. because in so many parts of the world, in developing nations, these type of things, buying Teslas, going vegan, are things that you need to be part of an affluent society in order to afford, in order to be normalized. And these aren't available to many parts of the developing world. So my question is, how does environmental justice play a role in fighting the climate crisis and in the work that you both do?
Well, yes, it does. But frankly, the developing world has largely moved on from the notion that the West is to blame for climate change and therefore they need to resolve it. It's obviously true that big countries and Western countries are largely to blame for it. But I think everybody realizes, well, except for somebody who used to be president across the border, that this is just a problem we need to solve and it has to be solved. And therefore, in India, in Pakistan, to some extent also in Tajikistan, we are engaging in Afghanistan. The government and the people don't say we don't want to do anything. They actually say help us to do something because we realize that it's all hands on deck. So what can we do? Well, obviously, if you don't have a car, then buying a Tesla is not a good idea for the climate, also too expensive. Going vegan, by the way, is always a great idea, but I eat less meat, but going vegan personally too radical for me. But a thing we focus on a lot is buildings and construction, because a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions are actually from buildings and construction. And there is a lot that can be done, because even small houses, little schools, little health centers emit a lot of greenhouse gases, and therefore we have a big push into green construction and operating buildings in a responsible way, building them so that they don't need so much air conditioning, creating environments that combat the urban heat island effect, which can only be fought otherwise with air conditioning, which of course is very bad, things like that. So that is something we focus on a lot, and our colleagues from AKF and AKRSP a lot on agriculture, but Dean Blade knows a lot more about that than I do, so I'm not going to get into that, but it is a very important part of the work that the AKDN at large does.
Yeah, and that's a great segue. So Dean Blade, I will pass the mic over to you. Does climate change disproportionately affect poorer or more remote communities when it comes to agriculture and food securities?
Absolutely. We certainly see that in the research that my colleagues do. There are all of these terms, food systems, the way that things work, but there are also other terms around food access. Even here in the city that I live, in Edmonton, we have food deserts where people have to go many blocks to be able to find fresh vegetables or fresh fruit. We think about the idea of food security, even in the line around food sovereignty, and the idea that people can actually control the food systems that they are participating in. So this whole area, I just think of a couple of examples. The food desert one here in Edmonton, but when I worked in sub-Saharan Africa, I happened to be in Liberia just after the Civil War, and a food shipment had come in because there were a number of people that were gathered together in refugee camps, but it had a commodity that people had not seen before. So it's not just about providing food to make sure that people have caloric intake. It's really about making sure that food is acceptable, that it's culturally appropriate. These are the sorts of things that we need to think about in all parts of the world. And, when I think about the work that we do around trying to find adaptation to climate change issues, we look at all aspects, whether it's carbon sequestration. We have 10,000 hectares of farms and ranches around the province of Alberta here in Western Canada. We're looking at how we can actually increase the amount of carbon that is locked away in soil by soil management practices, by the way that we graze animals. We have a forestry department where we train foresters within our faculty, and we're thinking about how we increase and ensure that carbon sequestration is occurring in our forests. So there are ways to do these things. Certainly many groups, including the Institute of Tropical Agriculture that I'm a board member of looks at water storage, the possibilities of irrigation for high-value crop production. These are the sorts of things that people can respond to, but we need to make sure that there is equity in the way that people have access to food, and that they indeed have an influence on things like food policy and the way that food is actually coming to their families and to their communities.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And when you say that there is a need for equity and people need to have a say, how do they get that say? How are the people able to get their voices heard in this?
I think we see it coming together when people start talking about that food system approach, that we have citizens involved, that we have producers involved, and there are some great examples around the world. I know things that I've been involved with in Nigeria. Here are things that are going on in Western Canada, where we have groups of people that are coming together talking about the types of principles that they want to see around safe, sustainable production of food, of nutritious food. It's really when people come together in this systems approach that there's the kind of dialogue that everyone certainly will appreciate. When I think about producers here in Western Canada, farmers that farm large areas of agricultural land, they want to be just as responsive to be able to provide the food that citizens are actually looking for. And we see farmers in our area making a lot of changes in their practices to ensure that there is sustainability in what they do, both for the benefit of all citizens, but also, of course, many of these individuals are multi-generation producers, farmers that want to make sure that they are good stewards of the land that they are using for their agricultural production.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And one of the things it makes me think of really is that when you look at the data and when you look at all the reporting that's been done about trends in the climate crisis and how climate change is affecting the world, data shows that communities of color, predominantly Black and Brown communities of color around the world, are disproportionately impacted by climate change and will be impacted the most by it the soonest. And in a year where the world saw so much racial reckoning, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on environmental justice and how we can achieve, as Dean Blade pointed out, achieve greater equity in our approaches to the environment.
Thanks. I love the question, although, Dean Blade and I are two white guys talking about it, so I just want to first acknowledge that. But I want to say it's really important to understand that climate change disproportionately affects developing countries. Obviously, developing countries from a racial perspective are overwhelmingly of color. And also, as His Highness long since observed, climate change disproportionately affects those parts of the world where predominantly Muslims live. So it has many layers. So I think the first thing is just to acknowledge that. The second thing is, you said that the work we do is ambitious, and you're right. Because it sounds really ambitious. You've got a girl of color being born in Afghanistan. She's a minority there, and I say she should have a great future. That's seriously ambitious. But it's really important to understand that any other ambition than that, I don't want to be nasty, but is in essence racist. Because why would she have a lesser ambition because of who she is and where she's born? And that's why we work hard to bring world-class planning to remote communities, because there's many layers of discrimination. And one of the layers is that people in remote places somehow have less opportunity than people who are born in the capital city or wherever. So I think that is a really important issue. It's also important not to do that in a paternalistic way, because I can't make that girl do better. I've got my own girl. It's going to be difficult for me to influence what she does, but I definitely can't influence anybody else's. You have to create the circumstances, the opportunity where people can do that for themselves in a very empowering way, which is the hallmark of how AKDN works. So I think Even when you strip all of that away, then I have to say the climate crisis is deeply unjust. It's unjust from a racial perspective, it's unjust from a minority religious perspective, it's unjust from a generational perspective, because people from my generation have worked to take away the future of people of my daughter's generation. My daughter is a lot younger than I was blessed with a daughter at a later age. I can only acknowledge that and work hard, but I can't fix the mistakes that we made in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Right now, it's all hands on deck. So I think the most relevant conversation is, how do you do the most work that benefits everybody, understanding that if you take any other perspective, it's not just unjust, it also won't work, because we literally have to do everything we can that works to have any chance at success.
That's so true and so powerful. And Dean Blade, I ask you the same question. How do we address this equity when it comes to the environment, and your thoughts on environmental justice in your line of work?
I appreciate the question, Aliya Jasmine. We are thinking a lot about how we do incorporate equity, inclusivity. Certainly here in Canada, we are also thinking a lot about Indigenous initiatives and how to ensure that we have this broader level of diversity in all that we do. We've been also very engaged. Maybe I would take it from the point of view of understanding, particularly when we consider gender. We've come a long way in the last 20 years. When we come together now within groups that are thinking about the next generation of innovations, women are front and center. We know that they are the primary agricultural producers in most parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Just as here in Canada, as we see more and more women coming on to farm groups, the commissions, the commodity agencies that are the groups that speak for farmers and producers. So having women engaged, to see women leading so many of the activities that are occurring. We've just had a new World Food Prize winner announced, and her background is in aquaculture. So I think it's identifying the people that are involved in the work that we do in production systems and ensuring that there is diversity in that conversation. Earlier, I spoke about how we do bring together, and all of us need to bring together these broader communities of people that are producing the food, that are processing it, that are making sure that it's distributed within our country or around the world. There just has to be this principle of inclusivity. And I think that we're making some progress there. But of course, as the events of the last 12 months have shown us, there's still a very long pathway ahead.
Oh, the aquaculture is so cool. And I'm actually, researching for stories down here on the coast of California about kelp farms. And so I love that that's an avenue that you're going down. It's interesting when we talk about the environment and race and that intersectionality, because indeed, this is a global issue, and we need to look at it as a global issue because the climate crisis knows no boundaries and knows no borders or country borders. So it really is a global issue. But when we're talking about the way that different communities, especially communities of color, are impacted by climate change, this is not reserved for simply the developing world. And I think it's important to note in this discussion that even within the Western world, even here in Los Angeles, there is a divide among racialized communities. I myself have, recently done stories about environmental stories on things like a tree canopy cover, where you really see that, for example, majority white affluent communities around LA have a lot of tree canopy cover, where a lot of less wealthy communities, mostly Black and brown communities, communities of color, don't have any tree canopy cover. And you both know the implications of living in an urban area that does not have any green space or tree canopy cover. And so this is a really important topic to have, not just on a global scale, but also on a local scale, that conversation about environmental justice and the conversation about the intersectionality between climate change and race and people of color. So really, really interesting discussion. And my final question for you guys is really one that looks forward. So what can you tell to people who, are so inspired by this conversation, as I have been over the last 30 minutes. And for those of us who are feeling this fire in our bellies to help your mission, how can we take action?
Well, I'm happy to start. Absolutely, we need to think about how all citizens can collaborate, can make a contribution. And I'm going to give a menu of things that maybe people could think about. People have been reading the press and following social media. There's a great deal of discussion now around food waste and food loss. Particularly here in North America, so much of that happens in the household, in wasted food, in discarded food when we go out to restaurants post-pandemic. So there are specific actions that we can take to ensure that we reduce that level of food waste or food loss. As taxpayers, you're doing a great job by investing in research and innovation, as colleagues such as mine and Onno's and people around the world are thinking about how do we create those new technologies, those new opportunities to produce food more efficiently, to ensure that it is has a high nutritional content. And I would also say to people that are out there, and perhaps to parents, we need the best and brightest to work in agriculture and food. I know that people sometimes want their children to be involved in perhaps certain professions, maybe even in broadcasting, Aliya Jasmine. But think about the opportunities for people to go into research on the types of things that we've spoken about here, around plant genetics, or on new food processing techniques, or all of the new ideas that are coming through in machine learning and artificial intelligence. We need that kind of a concentration of effort in the food and agriculture system, just as we're doing in a lot of other pieces of the economy. Plant a garden, support local businesses that are involved. We talked about communities of color. Here in my area, there are a number of companies that have started up that are providing interesting, new, unique foods that haven't been in the marketplace before. These are the kinds of things that people can get involved in to make sure that we actually are being able to adapt in a very complex time.
I'll pick up the question also, AJ, because it's a great question, and I want to go to a slightly different tack than the important things that Dean Blade said. So first of all, I believe many people get kind of stuck on climate change because they feel it's so difficult that they'll never be perfect, they'll never do enough, and anyway, what they're being asked to do is very inconvenient, and therefore people get stuck in doing nothing. So I want to say, if you feel fire in your belly, first of all, realize that you don't have to be perfect. I said I'm not going vegan because I just eat a little bit less meat. I can't bring myself to going vegan. I think that's okay. It would be better if I were vegan, but whatever. Think about what you can do and do something. So think about putting your thermostat for your air conditioning at 22, 23, not 18. Putting your heater in winter, not at 22, 23, but maybe at 19 or 20. Use public transport, eat less meat, recycle, don't drink bottled water. Whatever it is, you don't even have to do all of these things, but do some of them. If you want to buy a Tesla, go right ahead, or another electric car. But maybe you could use public transport or do a ride share and get a bike. If you're thinking biking is difficult, get an e-bike. Use renewable electricity if you charge it. It'd be a very good thing. Do something, because it is not that everybody has to be perfect in fighting climate change. It is that everybody has to do something, and something meaningful. And when you get into that mode, I think you'll invent other things that you can also do, and you'll realize that it saves you money. Some of it is really good. I've discovered that vegan hamburgers, because those I do eat, are actually better than beef hamburgers. Can't mention the brand, but it really is better. I prefer it now. And so I'm starting to think maybe vegan sausage. We'll get there. Do something. Don't try to be perfect, but don't think that your contribution is not important. If all of us do that, we'll get there.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think the idea of tackling the climate crisis is it seems so vast, and so the advice to just bite off what you can chew, try one thing, and then go from there. That's a great starting off point, and a great thing everybody can do. I guess, the last thing I'll ask you before we end this fascinating conversation is really, is there anything I haven't asked you? Is there anything that has not come up within this conversation that you think is really important for our viewers to know?
Well, thank you very much, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you. The one thing I would suggest, I am very positive about the future. I know that we face many challenges, but the reason for my positivity is the engagement that I have with young people. Of course, I have the benefit of 22 or 2,300 students within our faculty pursuing their undergraduate or graduate degrees. But when I see the kinds of things that they're doing, not only for their studies, but in extracurricular activities, getting involved in food security issues, engaging with communities. And I've seen the same in sub-Saharan Africa, where young people are really starting to see agriculture. People are using the term agripreneurs these days, as young individuals are coming in and thinking, how can they actually find a job, a livelihood in agriculture? And they see some real promise, not only because of the economic opportunities that are out there, and they are significant in the entire agriculture and food space around the world, but that people also want to give back. We see so many more students coming from urban environments. Traditionally, we always attracted people coming from rural areas to get undergraduate or graduate degrees in agriculture or food programs. But now these urban students are coming in because they really want to make a difference in the topics that we've spoken about today around climate change, around social justice, and they see agriculture, food as that hub that they can really get involved in. So I take great solace in that, and I think as we pass that torch to these people that are already making such a difference, these young people are really going to set us on the right pathway forward.
I want to say, and I want to repeat, climate change is not doomsday. It can be, but it doesn't need to be. We can actually work ourselves out of this. Now, if we want to do that, then we need very powerful leadership on the one hand, and we need individual action from every individual, as I just talked. Now, I do want to focus on leadership. We're really excited in the AKDN that His Highness made climate change a banner theme for the AKDN. And when I go around and talk to beneficiaries and stakeholders in the AKDN, I get tremendous response because people are excited. It's important to understand that the leadership we need for success in climate change is in our own families. We need to listen to our children. Our children already know more about climate change than any of us do, and that includes you, AJ. You're much younger than I am, but it includes all of us. We need to listen to our children and understand that it is their future. They have much greater awareness. They learn things in school that we still struggle to understand, and they are bold in their actions. So just like we did in the anti-smoking campaign, we need to understand the power of youth to make change. And I believe it's really tremendous, and I believe it's the key to success. So in a way, that means that I can think about what I do next or maybe retire, and that's cool, because young people already know how to solve this problem. So let them solve it and follow their lead.
Wow, wow, wow. So inspiring. And I think that's the perfect, button to end this conversation with, is the idea that, dealing with climate change and tackling climate change, it's not doomsday, that there is so much excitement and innovation and ambitious ideas out there that we can all look forward to get involved with to tackle this together. So thank you guys so much for being part of this fascinating conversation. It was really enjoyable for me, and I hope it was for you guys, as I'm sure it was for all of our viewers. So thank you both for being here today.
Thanks, AJ.
Thank you so much.
What a fascinating conversation about climate change, about climate refugees, food security and agriculture, race and the environment. I found that so interesting, and I just wanted to thank both of our speakers for their time, as well as our partner, the University of Alberta, for making this fascinating conversation happen. And thank you to all of you, our viewers, for your time and for your interest in this subject. We look forward to bringing you our next edition of this event series in the fall of 2021. Thank you.